The rain that fell on Sao Paulo in the year 2241 was not clean, and it had not been clean for a very long time. It came down gray and warm, carrying the ash of forests that no longer existed and the dust of cities that had drowned beneath rising seas. And it pooled in the cracked streets where millions of people still tried to live their lives as if the world was not ending around them. But the world was ending. Amara Osai stood on the rooftop of the United Terran Compact headquarters and watched that dirty rain slide down the windows of buildings that leaned like tired old men. And she held in her hands a data tablet that contained the most ambitious blueprint humanity had ever created. She was 43 years old, born in Accra, raised in Lagos before the Great Seawall collapsed and swallowed her family and her childhood in one terrible night of black water and screaming. And she had spent every day since then building things, bridges and towers and shelters and walls, as if she could rebuild the world one structure at a time. But the world did not want to be rebuilt anymore. The oceans had risen 11 meters in the last century, and the coastlines of every continent had been redrawn by salt water and sorrow, and the air carried so much carbon that children in some cities had never seen a blue sky, and the soil in the great farmlands of the Americas and Asia had turned to dust, and wars over fresh water and clean food had shattered nations into pieces that could barely hold themselves together. The United Terran Compact was all that remained, a fragile alliance of surviving governments and scientists and corporations who had looked at the dying Earth and decided that arguing about who was to blame was less important than figuring out what to do next. And what Amara wanted to do next was insane. She walked into the assembly hall that evening, her boots still wet from the rain, and she stood before 300 delegates from every corner of the broken world, and she placed her tablet on the podium, and she said one word that silenced the room. Eden. The holographic display behind her lit up with a structure so massive that several delegates actually laughed, because laughter was easier than believing. It was a Stanford torus, a rotating ring habitat designed to float at the Lagrange point between Earth and Mars, and it was 80 kilometers in diameter, and it would spin to create gravity, and it would contain 7 complete biomes copied from Earth, and it would house 500 million human beings in a self-sustaining world that needed nothing from the dying planet below. This is not a space station, Amara told them, and her voice did not shake even though her hands wanted to. This is a lifeboat, and we need to start building it today, because tomorrow may be too late. The arguments lasted for weeks. Some delegates called it a fantasy, a waste of resources that should be spent fixing Earth, and they were not entirely wrong, because the cost would be staggering. Every mine, every factory, every spare kilogram of metal and glass and fiber would need to be redirected upward, toward a dream that floated in the black emptiness of space. But Amara had numbers, and her numbers were merciless. Earth could not be saved, not in time, not with what they had left, and every climate model and resource projection and agricultural forecast said the same thing. Humanity had 50 years, maybe 70, before the cascading failures made the planet unable to support large-scale civilization. 50 years to build a new home or watch the species die. In the end, the vote passed by a margin of 12, and Project Eden was born, and Amara Osai was named its director, and the weight of 500 million future lives settled onto her shoulders like a coat made of stars and stone. Across the solar system, a woman named Yuki Tanaka received the news on the bridge of the cargo hauler Iron Promise Asterisk, which was drifting through the asteroid belt with a crew of 40 miners who smelled like engine grease and recycled air. Tanaka was 51, Japanese by birth, a spacer by necessity, and she had spent 30 years in the void mining asteroids, hauling ore, burying friends who died in decompression accidents or radiation storms. And she had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from the same rock she mined, all sharp edges and quiet strength. The message from the UTC was simple. Captain Tanaka was to assemble the largest mining and transport fleet in human history and begin harvesting the raw materials needed to build Eden. She read the blueprints and the tonnage requirements and the timeline, and she did not laugh, because Yuki Tanaka had never found laughter useful in situations that called for action. "Get me every ship that can fly and every miner that can swing a drill," she told her first officer. "We have a station to feed." Back on Earth, a third figure moved through corridors that were very different from Amara's concrete towers or Tanaka's steel hallways. Dr. Elias Vren was humanity's senior xenolinguist and its unofficial ambassador to the wider galaxy. A galaxy that had been watching Earth with mild curiosity for about 2 centuries, the way a person might watch an anthill near their front door. The galactic community was governed by the Conclave of 12, an assembly of elder species who had been traveling between stars for thousands or even millions of years, and they had first detected humanity's radio signals in the early 21st century and had been observing ever since, with the detached interest of scientists studying something that would probably not survive. Vren had spent 20 years trying to change their minds. He had learned their languages, all 9 major ones and dozens of minor dialects, and he had traveled to their stations on the edge of the solar system, and he had made his case with data and passion and everything he had. Humanity needed help, technology, resources, knowledge, and the Conclave had all of it in abundance, and sharing even a fraction of it could mean the difference between survival and extinction. The Conclave said no. They always said no. Their official reason was the non-interference doctrine, a policy that said developing species must advance on their own without outside contamination, and it sounded noble and principled when they said it in their ancient, musical languages. But Vren knew the real reason, because the Valeth ambassador had told him once, in a rare moment of honesty, during a private meeting on a station that orbited Neptune. The Valeth was tall, nearly 3 meters, with silver skin, and 4 eyes that saw in spectrums humans could not even name, and he had looked down at Vren with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt, and he had said, "Your species burns too brightly, Dr. Vren. That is why you will burn out. Every species that burns as you do eventually consumes itself, and we have learned that it is better to let the fire die on its own than to try to control it." Vren had returned to Earth after that meeting and had not slept for 3 days. Now, standing in his office in Geneva, watching the news feeds fill with images of Eden's blueprints and the assembly vote, and the crowds in the streets who were either celebrating or rioting depending on which city you looked at, he felt something cold and hard settle into his chest. It was not despair. Vren had used up all his despair years ago. It was something else, something that tasted like iron and smelled like rain on hot pavement. It was resolve. He opened a channel to the Conclave relay station and recorded what he knew would be his final appeal. A calm, measured, 15-minute argument for assistance that covered every logical and moral and practical reason why the Conclave should help humanity build Eden. He sent it and received a reply within the hour, a single line of text in the formal Valeth diplomatic language that translated roughly to, "Your request has been received and denied. We wish you clarity in your remaining years." Vren closed the channel and deleted the reply, and sat in silence for a long time. Outside, the gray rain of Sao Paulo kept falling, and in the asteroid belt, Yuki Tanaka was already calling in every favor she had ever earned. And in the assembly hall, Amara Osai was staring at a holographic model of Eden and making a list of everything that could go wrong, which was a very long list. And somewhere beyond the orbit of Neptune, the Conclave of 12 watched and waited, confident that this latest human madness would collapse under its own ambition like every other project the short-lived species had attempted. They were wrong, but they did not know that yet. Amara stepped out onto the rooftop one more time that night and looked up at the sky, and the clouds were too thick to show any stars. But she knew they were there, and she whispered to no one in particular, "They will not help us, good, we will remember that." Then she went back inside and got to work. The asteroid belt was not a place that forgave mistakes. It was a vast and silent graveyard of rock and ice and metal that stretched between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter, and it did not care about human dreams or schedules, or the 500 million lives that depended on what Yuki Tanaka and her people could pull from its cold, spinning stones. Tanaka stood on the bridge of the asterisk Iron Promise and watched through the observation window as her fleet, if you could call it a fleet, assembled around the asteroid designated KR7714, a dark and ugly mountain of iron and nickel that was about to become the bones of Eden. She had gathered 412 ships in 8 months, and calling them a fleet was generous, because most of them were old cargo haulers and retired mining rigs and converted passenger vessels that had been patched together with welding torches and prayers. And their crews were not soldiers or heroes, but miners and mechanics and engineers and cooks and medics who had answered the UTC's call because someone had to. "All ships report ready, Captain," her first officer said. "Then we dig," Tanaka replied, and the belt campaign began. The first year was the hardest. They drilled into asteroids and shattered them with controlled explosions, and scooped up the fragments with magnetic nets, and fed them into floating refinery stations that melted rock into metal and metal into beams and beams into the skeleton of a world that did not yet exist. And people died. They died in decompression blowouts when drill bits hit gas pockets and cracked open their habitation modules like eggs. And they died in radiation storms that came without warning and cooked them inside their suits. And they died in collisions when asteroids shifted under thrust and crushed ships against larger rocks. And they died in quiet ways too: heart attacks from overwork, strokes from stress, suicides from the loneliness of spending months in a tin, surrounded by nothing but vacuum and silence. Tanaka kept a list of every name. She wrote them in a small paper notebook that she carried in her jacket pocket, and every night she opened it and read the new names and then closed it and put it away and went back to work, because grief was a luxury she could not afford until the job was done. By the end of the first year, the list had 219 names, and the refinery stations had produced enough structural alloy to begin assembling the first section of Eden's ring. They called it the spine. It was built in Earth orbit by a separate team of construction workers who lived in temporary habitats that clung to the growing structure like barnacles on a whale, and they welded and bolted and riveted day and night in shifts that never stopped. And when the spine reached 20 kilometers in length and was visible from the ground with the naked eye, something changed on Earth. People looked up. They looked up from their flooded streets and their dust-choked farms and their underground shelters, and they saw a line of light in the sky that had not been there before. And for the first time in a generation, they felt something that had been missing for so long that many of them had forgotten its name. Hope. Amara watched the spine grow from her office in the orbital construction platform, and she slept 4 hours a night and ate when her assistants forced food into her hands. And she solved problems that should have been unsolvable: heat distribution failures and structural resonance issues and supply chain nightmares. And she did it with a focus that frightened the people around her, because they could see that she was burning through herself like a candle in a furnace. "You need to rest," her deputy told her one evening. "The dead do not rest," Amara replied. And her deputy did not know if she was talking about the workers who had died building Eden or about her family who had died in Lagos, and he decided not to ask. In the third year of construction, the Rootbound struck. The Rootbound were a political faction on Earth who believed that every resource being sent into space should stay on the ground, and their argument was not without merit. People were hungry and sick, and dying on Earth, while trillions of credits and megatons of material were being launched into orbit. But their methods were not peaceful. A group of root-bound hackers infiltrated the navigation system of a supply shuttle carrying construction equipment and redirected it into a habitation platform on the outer edge of the spine, and the explosion killed 312 workers in an instant. Amara received the news while she was reviewing structural plans, and she stopped and put her hands flat on the table and closed her eyes and breathed, and when she opened them again her face was made of stone. Some of her advisors wanted to call it an attack and demand that Earth governments hunt the root-bound down with military force, and others wanted to shut down construction until security could be improved, and others simply wanted to scream. Amara did none of these things. She walked to the communication array and broadcast a message that was heard on every screen and speaker, and radio on Earth and in space. 312 people died today because someone decided that destroying is easier than building. They were wrong. Destruction is not easier. It is simply lazier. We will mourn our dead, and we will repair the damage, and we will continue, because this station is not about politics or factions or arguments. It is about whether our children will have a place to live. If you want to fight each other, go ahead, but we have a station to build. The broadcast silenced the root-bound for nearly a year, and volunteers flooded the recruitment centers, and construction accelerated. Far away, beyond the edges of the solar system, someone else was watching. The Conclave of 12 had dispatched observation drones to monitor humanity's progress, small and stealthy machines that hid among the debris in Earth orbit, and recorded everything with sensors that could count the rivets on a hull from 1,000 kilometers away. The data went back to the Conclave's headquarters, a massive station orbiting a red dwarf star in the constellation humans called Ophiuchus, and it was reviewed by analysts from all 12 member species. The Thesic were the first to sound the alarm. The Thesic were an insectoid species, six-limbed, compound-eyed, brilliant engineers who had built some of the most elegant structures in the galaxy, and their senior analyst, a being whose name translated roughly to one who counts the angles, reviewed the human construction data and felt a sensation in its thorax that it had not felt since it was young. Confusion. This should not be working, it reported to the Thesic delegation. Their materials are inferior, their methods are crude, they use manual labor where any civilized species would use automated systems. Their error rate is 17 times higher than acceptable standards, and yet the structure is sound. They are compensating for every flaw with redundancy and adaptation and sheer persistence. They are not engineering this station. They are willing it into existence. The Thesic had built their own orbital habitats over the course of 400 years, using conclave technology and conclave guidance and conclave resources, and the idea that a species barely 2 centuries into spaceflight could achieve something similar in a decade was not just improbable. It was offensive to everything the Thesic understood about how civilization was supposed to work. The Valith delegation received the Thesic report with even less enthusiasm. The Valith were the eldest of the elder species, ancient and proud, and accustomed to being the ones who set the rules, and they had built their empire on the assumption that progress was slow and orderly and controlled, and that species who tried to skip steps in the great ladder of development would inevitably fall. Humanity was not falling. Humanity was climbing faster than anything the Valith had ever seen, and it was climbing with broken tools and bleeding hands, and it was not stopping. The Valith ambassador, the same one who had dismissed Dr. Vren years earlier, sat in his quarters and reviewed the data for a long time, and when his aide entered the room, the ambassador said something that the aide later described as the most disturbing thing he had ever heard from a Valith elder. "I believe I am frightened," the ambassador said. His aide, who had served him for 60 years, asked carefully, "Frightened of what, ambassador?" The ambassador turned his 4 silver eyes toward the viewport, where the stars burned cold and indifferent, and said, "Of what they will become when they finish." Back in the belt, Tanaka's crews had begun the final phase of raw material extraction, and the last of the great asteroids, a monster called KR9981 that was nearly the size of a small moon, was being broken apart and fed into the refineries. And in Earth orbit, Dr. Lena Vasquez, a small, quiet woman from Buenos Aires who had spent her entire career studying fusion reactions, stood before the most important machine humanity had ever built. The fusion core was the heart of Eden, a contained miniature sun that would provide light and heat and energy for the entire habitat. And if it failed, Eden would be nothing more than a very large and very expensive tomb. Vasquez ran the final diagnostics and checked every reading twice, and then a third time. And then she looked at Amara through the observation window and gave a single nod. Amara pressed the ignition command. The core pulsed once, a deep, golden light that filled the chamber like liquid sunrise, and then it stabilized, and the readings came back green, and a small sun burned in the darkness of space for the first time in history. Every human ship in the solar system sounded its horn, a tradition borrowed from the old ocean vessels of Earth, and the sound was carried through communication relays from Mercury to the outer belt. And for one brief and perfect moment, every human being alive was connected by that sound. On the bridge of the asterisk Iron Promise, Yuki Tanaka watched the golden light on her monitor, and tears ran down her carved stone face, and she did not wipe them away. "For the list," she whispered, touching the notebook in her pocket. "We did it for the list." The skeleton was finished, but a skeleton is not a body, and a body is not alive. Eden hung in the void at the Lagrange point between Earth and Mars, a massive ring of metal and glass and carbon fiber, 80 kilometers across, spinning slowly against the stars like a wheel that God had forgotten to attach to anything, and it was empty. Empty and cold and dark, except for the golden heartbeat of the fusion core at its center, pulsing like a promise. Amara Osai stood in the grassland sector and looked out at 16 square kilometers of bare metal floor that was supposed to become a prairie, and she felt the weight of what still needed to be done pressing against her chest like a hand. Building the structure had been the easy part. Now they had to make it breathe. The biome seeding program was the most complex ecological engineering project in human history, and it began with dirt. Not just any dirt, soil, real soil, teeming with bacteria and fungi and microscopic organisms that had taken nature billions of years to develop. And it had to be transported from Earth in sealed containers and spread across Eden's 7 biome sectors and cultivated until it could support plant life, which would produce oxygen, which would create atmosphere, which would allow rain, which would allow rivers, which would allow life. Each step depended on the one before it, and a failure at any point would cascade through the entire system like a crack spreading through glass. Amara assembled a team of 3,000 ecologists, biologists, soil scientists, hydrologists, and agricultural engineers, and she told them something that made several of them laugh nervously. "We are going to build an entire planet's worth of ecosystems inside a metal ring in 5 years. Any questions?" There were many questions. The rainforest biome alone required 47 different soil types and over 300 species of plants and insects and fungi, all of which had to be balanced in exactly the right proportions or the whole system would collapse into a dead brown mess within months. The oceanic biome needed actual seawater, millions of liters of it, hauled from Earth and filtered, and seeded with plankton and kelp and fish and coral, and 1,000 other organisms that did not know or care that they were floating in space. The tundra biome required permafrost, which required temperatures near freezing, which required a separate climate control system that had to work within meters of the grassland biome's temperate zone, without either one contaminating the other. It was madness, and it was beautiful, and it was the kind of challenge that humans were uniquely suited for, because no other species in the galaxy would have attempted something so complicated and so fragile and so necessary all at the same time. The work took 4 years, and it nearly broke them. There were failures. The desert biome sand kept contaminating the wetland sector through air circulation vents, and the rainforest humidity levels caused mold to grow on the structural supports, and the oceanic biome's first fish population died within weeks because the water chemistry was off by a fraction of a percent. And each failure meant starting over, recalibrating, trying again. But they did try again every time, because that was what humans did. And then, on a Tuesday morning in the year 2250, the atmospheric engineers triggered the water cycle. Moisture generators pumped humid air into the upper reaches of the grassland sector, where it rose and cooled against the climate control barriers, and clouds formed, actual clouds, white and soft and impossible, inside a metal ring floating in space. And then it rained. It rained on soil that had been carried from Earth in sealed boxes, on grass seeds that had been planted by hand by scientists who had spent years preparing for this moment, on metal floors that had been covered with rock and clay and loam until they looked like ground, real ground, the kind you could dig your fingers into and smell the earth. The construction workers stopped what they were doing. Some of them had been in space for years, living in tin cans and breathing recycled air and showering with rationed water, and they had almost forgotten what rain felt like. And now it was falling on their faces in a place that should not have had rain, in a place that existed only because a woman from Ghana had refused to accept that the world was ending. They stood in it with their arms out and their faces up, and some of them cried, and some of them laughed, and some of them simply stood in silence and let the water wash away the dust and the grief and the exhaustion. Amara watched from the observation deck above, and she pressed her hand against the glass, and for one moment she was not the director of Project Eden but a girl in Lagos watching rain fall on her mother's garden, and the memory was so sharp and so sweet that it cut her open. She let it. Then she wiped her eyes and called her team and said, "The tundra sector's drainage system needs recalibrating. Get on it." Because there was always more work. On Earth, the UTC announced the migration lottery, a system for selecting the first 10 million colonists who would move to Eden, and the world held its breath. Every living human being over the age of 16 was automatically entered, and the selection would be random, and families would be kept together, and there would be no exceptions for wealth or power or connections, because Amara had insisted on this with a ferocity that surprised even her allies. "If we build a paradise and fill it with the privileged, then we have built nothing worth saving," she told the UTC assembly, and no one argued with her, because by now no one argued with Amara about anything related to Eden. The lottery results came out on a single day, broadcast to every screen on the planet, and 10 million names appeared in alphabetical order, and the world split in two. Those who were chosen wept with relief and guilt and joy, and those who were not chosen wept with despair and anger, and a terrible understanding that they might be the ones who stayed behind on a dying world. But something unexpected happened in the days that followed. People who had been selected began giving up their spots, not many, but enough to be noticed. Parents who wanted their children to go but chose to stay behind themselves. Young people who said that the elderly deserved the chance more. Doctors and engineers who said they were needed on Earth and could not leave in good conscience. And people who had not been selected began volunteering to help with the migration logistics, knowing they would never set foot on Eden themselves, working 16-hour days to make sure that those who were going would arrive safely. Dr. Elias Vren watched this and felt something move in his chest, and he recorded a documentary about it, about the lottery and the sacrifices and the quiet heroism of ordinary people, and he broadcast it on the Galactic Communication Network, which the Conclave had reluctantly allowed humanity to access years earlier, for diplomatic purposes. The documentary spread across dozens of worlds. The younger species, civilizations that had only been in the conclave for a few thousand years, watched it with fascination and something that looked very much like admiration, and on 17 different planets, beings who had never met a human began to ask their governments a simple question: why are we not helping them? The Conclave of 12 noticed this, and they did not like it. An emergency session was called, the first in over a century, and the 12 elder species gathered in their great hall, a chamber carved from the heart of an asteroid and lit by bioluminescent crystals that pulsed in time with the speakers' voices. The Dreamari delegation spoke first. The Dreamari were relatively young by conclave standards, only 40,000 years of spacefaring civilization, and they were mammalian and warm-blooded and had faces that could express emotion in ways that the older species found slightly vulgar, and their ambassador stood before the assembly and said, "We have watched a species build a Class IV habitat from nothing, without our help, without our technology, without our permission, and they have done it in less than a decade. We should be celebrating this, not treating it as a threat." The Valith ambassador rose and spoke in the calm, ancient tones that his species used when they were about to do something terrible. "The humans are not a threat because they are building a station. They are a threat because of what they represent." Every species in this conclave was uplifted, guided, given the tools to build their habitats and their empires. It is how civilization works. It is how order is maintained. And now a species has bypassed the entire system and built something that should have taken them centuries, and they did it with raw metal and stubbornness. And if the younger species see this and begin to question the value of the conclave's guidance, then the foundation of everything we have built for millions of years begins to crack. The chamber was silent. Then the Valith ambassador proposed a classified motion, one that would never appear in any public record: Operation Still Garden, a covert program to sabotage Eden's systems and cause the project to fail in a way that would look like natural engineering failure. The vote was 7-5 in favor. The Dreamari ambassador walked out of the chamber without speaking and returned to her ship and stood alone in her quarters for a very long time. Then she opened a secure channel and sent a message to the one human she had been secretly communicating with for years. Dr. Elias Vren received the message at 3 in the morning, Earth time, and when he read it, his blood turned to ice. He called Amara first, and then he called Tanaka, and he told them both the same thing: the conclave has voted to destroy Eden. Amara was quiet for 10 seconds, which was the longest Vren had ever known her to be quiet, and then she said, "How long do we have?" "Months, maybe less." "Then we work faster." Tanaka's response was different. She was on her ship in the belt, overseeing the final ore shipments, and when she heard the news, her jaw tightened and her eyes went hard and cold, and she said 5 words that Vren would remember for the rest of his life. "Let them come for us." Inside Eden, the rain continued to fall on green and growing things, and a child who had been born on the station, one of the first, ran through the grassland biome and picked a small yellow flower and brought it to her mother, and her mother held it like it was made of gold. Outside in the dark between the stars, conclave warships began to move. They did not come with guns blazing and war drums beating, because the conclave was far too old and far too clever for that. They came with paperwork. A fleet of 63 conclave warships, sleek and silver and ancient, each one larger than anything humanity had ever built, dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the solar system, and glided toward the Lagrange point with the calm, unhurried grace of predators who knew their prey could not run. The Valith commander, a tall, 4-eyed officer named Shurvan, broadcast a message on all frequencies, and his voice was polite and measured and cold as starlight. "Attention, human construction project designated Eden. The Conclave of 12 has determined that your structure violates Interstellar Construction Code 7, Section 41, regarding unauthorized megastructure development by pre-uplift species. A quarantine zone is hereby established within a radius of 500,000 kilometers of your structure. All supply traffic will be suspended until a full review is completed. This is not a hostile action. This is a regulatory procedure. Please comply. Tanaka, who had brought her fleet to Eden 3 weeks earlier after Vren's warning, listened to this message from the bridge of the Asterisk Iron Promise and said a word that would have gotten her thrown out of any diplomatic meeting on Earth. Her fleet was 47 ships, 47 battered, dented, exhausted mining vessels crewed by people who were better with drills than weapons, against 63 warships that represented millions of years of technological superiority. "They are not going to shoot us," Vren said over the communication channel from his office on Eden. "They cannot. If they fire on a civilian habitat, every younger species in the galaxy will revolt. They are going to strangle us instead, cut off our supplies, and wait for us to fail on our own." He was right. The blockade sealed every supply route between Eden and the Belt, and the cargo shipments that had been keeping the station fed and fueled and functional stopped overnight, and Eden began to starve. But that was only the first attack. The second was invisible. Conclave infiltration drones, machines so small they could pass through air vents and so sophisticated they could rewrite code at the molecular level, had been seeded into Eden systems during the months before the fleet arrived, and now they activated. The atmosphere processors began to glitch, producing air that was slightly too rich in nitrogen and slightly too poor in oxygen. Not enough to notice immediately, but enough to cause headaches and fatigue and confusion over days and weeks. The climate control systems in the rainforest biome shifted by 2 degrees, and the carefully balanced humidity began to kill the more delicate plant species. The water recycling system developed mysterious blockages that reduced output by 15%. And worst of all, the fusion core, Eden's heart, its miniature sun, began to fluctuate, sending power surges and drops through the entire station that made lights flicker and systems crash and people afraid. Amara knew what was happening. Vren's Dreamari contact had warned them about the sabotage, but knowing and fixing were very different things, because the infiltration drones were designed by civilizations that had been building machines for longer than humanity had existed, and finding them was like searching for a specific grain of sand on a beach. "We cannot find them all in time," her chief engineer told her. "They are in everything, the code, the hardware, the atmospheric system. We would need to strip the entire station down to bare metal and rebuild from scratch." Amara looked at him, and something shifted behind her eyes, not despair but something harder and sharper, something that burned. "Then that is what we will do," she said. And humanity did what it had always done when faced with a problem it could not solve with sophistication. It used stubbornness. Amara's engineers ripped out every compromised digital system, every processor, every controller, every automated routine, and replaced them with analog backups that the infiltration drones could not touch, because you cannot hack a mechanical switch or corrupt a hand-cranked valve or infiltrate a system that runs on human judgment instead of code. It was crude and it was ugly, and it meant that tasks that had been automated now required human hands working around the clock, and the already exhausted crews were pushed to the breaking point and then pushed past it. But it worked. The atmosphere stabilized and the climate controls were brought back to manual operation, and the water system was flushed and rebuilt with physical filters, and the lights stopped flickering, and Eden breathed again, roughly, unevenly, like a patient recovering from surgery. But it breathed. Tanaka handled the supply problem with the same blunt creativity. She could not get her big ships through the blockade. The conclave vessels would intercept anything large enough to detect, So she built something the Conclave had never seen before. Microships. Hundreds of them, each no bigger than a refrigerator, unmanned and unshielded and running on simple chemical thrusters that produced almost no detectable signature, loaded with compressed food and water and critical spare parts, and launched from hidden positions throughout the belt on trajectories so scattered and random that tracking them all would require more computing power than the Conclave fleet had allocated to the entire operation. The first wave of microships reached Eden 3 days after launch, slipping through the gaps in the blockade like seeds through a fence, and Tanaka watched the supply indicators on her display tick upward and allowed herself a small, fierce smile. "You can block a river," she told her crew, "but you cannot block the rain." And then something happened that no one, not Amara, not Tanaka, not Vren, not the Conclave had expected. The Rootbound helped. The same faction that had crashed a shuttle into Eden's construction platform and killed 300 people. The same group that had called Eden a waste and a crime and a betrayal of Earth, sent a message to Director Osai through encrypted channels. "We were wrong about Eden. We are not wrong about fighting. Send us the infiltration code signatures, and we will trace them to their source." Amara hesitated for exactly 1 second, and then she sent the data, because when your house is burning, you do not ask the person handing you water why they set the fire last year. The Rootbound hackers, some of the most skilled on Earth, which was saying something, because humanity had been hacking since before it had been a spacefaring species, tore into the Conclave's infiltration code with a viciousness that startled even Amara's engineers. And within a week, they had mapped the entire sabotage network and began neutralizing the remaining drones one by one. On the 15th day of the blockade, Dr. Elias Vren did the bravest thing he had ever done. He hijacked the Galactic Communication Network. It was not easy. The network was maintained by the Conclave and protected by encryption that was supposed to be unbreakable. But Vren had spent 20 years studying alien languages and alien systems and alien minds, and he knew things about the network's architecture that its builders had forgotten. And with the help of his Dreamori contact, he found a backdoor. He broadcast a live feed from inside Eden to every receiver in the galaxy. The feed showed everything: the flickering lights, the wilting crops, the engineers working 20-hour shifts with dark circles under their eyes and grease on their hands, the children drawing pictures of stars on the walls of their quarters because they had never seen real stars through the blocked viewports, the old woman in the grassland biome who watered her small garden every morning even though the water rations barely covered drinking. And then Vren spoke, and his voice was carried across light years to billions of beings who had never heard a human speak before. "You call yourself civilized," he said, and his voice was calm and tired and absolutely unbreaking. "You sit in your stations that were built for you by those who came before, and you look down at us, and you call yourself civilized, but right now, at this moment, you are watching a nursery and trying to smother the crib we asked for nothing. We asked you for help once years ago, and you said no, and we accepted that, and we built this place with our own hands and our own sweat and our own dead. And now you are afraid of what we have built, and so you have come to tear it down, not with weapons, because you are too proud for that, but with codes and blockades and regulations that you invented yesterday to solve a problem that has existed for a decade." He paused, and in the silence, the sound of Eden's struggling ventilation system hummed like a heartbeat. "You should be afraid of us," Vren continued. "Not because we will fight you, we will not, but because we will finish this. You know we will. You have watched us bleed and die and fail and get back up for 10 years. And you know, in whatever place inside you where honesty lives, that we will finish this. And when we do, the galaxy will never be the same, and every species that was told they needed your permission to grow will look at what we did and know that they do not." The broadcast lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds, and it was seen by an estimated 9 billion beings across 41 inhabited star systems. The effect was immediate. On the Dreamari homeworld, crowds gathered in the public squares and demanded action, and the Dreamari government, which had been secretly supporting Vren for years, finally had the political cover it needed. The Dreamari fleet, 32 warships that had been stationed with the Conclave formation, broke ranks without warning and accelerated toward Eden, and the Dreamari ambassador broadcast her own message to the Conclave commander. "We are delivering humanitarian supplies to the human habitat. Fire on us if you wish. It will be the last thing the Conclave ever does." 3 other species followed within the hour: the Kelani, the Shurth, and the Orvani, all younger races who had been watching the blockade with growing disgust. And suddenly Shurvan's 63 ships were facing 32 Dreamari warships and 41 allied vessels, and the mathematics of intimidation had changed dramatically. Shurvan, who was old and proud but not stupid, looked at the tactical display and understood that firing a single shot would start a civil war that would tear the Conclave apart, and he gave the order to withdraw. But the damage was not yet over. The fusion core, sabotaged weeks earlier by infiltration drones that had burrowed deeper than anyone had found, was failing. The fluctuations grew worse, and the golden light that had burned steady for years began to pulse erratically. An alarm screamed through the station, and Amara ran to the core chamber with Dr. Vasquez beside her, and they both knew what had to be done. The recalibration had to be done manually, inside the chamber, within meters of a contained fusion reaction that was producing enough radiation to kill an unprotected human in minutes. Vasquez did not hesitate. She suited up in the heaviest radiation gear they had, which was not heavy enough, and they both knew it, and she entered the chamber, and Amara guided her through the recalibration sequence from the control room. And for 47 minutes, Lena Vasquez stood inside a dying sun and coaxed it back to life with steady hands and a voice that did not tremble. The core stabilized. The lights came back on, all of them, everywhere, across the entire station, and the golden glow returned to the fusion core like a sunrise after a storm. Vasquez walked out of the chamber under her own power, and then she collapsed, and the medical team rushed to her, and the radiation burns on her arms and face and chest would take months to heal and would leave scars she would carry for the rest of her life. Amara knelt beside her and took her hand, and Vasquez looked up at her with eyes that were already swelling shut, and she smiled and said, "The core holds, Director Eden lives." Outside, the last Conclave ships disappeared into faster-than-light travel, and the blockade was over, and Tanaka stood on her bridge and watched them go. Her comms officer asked, "What should we do, Captain?" Tanaka looked at the golden light of Eden glowing in the darkness, and she touched the notebook in her pocket and she said, "Nothing, we have a station to finish." The first ship arrived on a morning that had been invented by engineers. Inside Eden, the fusion core had been calibrated to mimic a sunrise, a slow, golden warming that spread across the grassland biome in the same way the sun had once crept over the plains of Kenya or the fields of Kansas. And it was under this artificial dawn that the transport vessel New Horizon docked at Port 1 and opened its doors, and the first wave of colonists stepped into their new home. There were 10,000 of them on that first ship, families and individuals and elderly couples and children who had never known anything but the dying earth, and they walked down the gangway in silence, because silence was the only response that made sense when you stepped out of a metal corridor and into a world. The grassland biome stretched before them, 16 square kilometers of green, living prairie under a sky that curved gently upward and became the far side of the ring, where they could see, impossibly, more land and more green and more life hanging above them like a mirror image of paradise. A woman from Dhaka who was 73 years old and had spent her entire life in a city that was half underwater knelt down and pressed her hands into the soil, and it was warm and dark and alive, and she said something in Bengali that the people around her did not understand but felt in their bones. It smells like home. Behind her, children who had been born in underground shelters ran into the grass and screamed with a joy that was so pure it hurt to hear, and their parents watched them with faces that could not decide between laughing and weeping, so they did both. Over the following weeks, the migration continued. Ship after ship docked at Eden's ports, carrying 10,000 souls each, and the station filled with voices and footsteps and cooking smells and arguments and music, and all the chaotic, messy, beautiful noise of human life. The urban biome, a city sector designed to feel like the best parts of every city on Earth without the worst parts, came alive with markets and cafes and workshops and schools, and people who had been strangers on Earth became neighbors in space, and the old human talent for building community out of nothing kicked in with a speed that surprised even the sociologists who had been planning for this moment. The rainforest biome became a place where people went to be alone and think, walking beneath trees that had been saplings when they were planted, and were now tall enough to create a canopy that filtered the fusion light into green and gold shadows. The oceanic biome, a vast saltwater lake with engineered tides and a coral reef that was slowly, stubbornly growing, became the place where children learned to swim and old fishermen discovered that fish in space tasted the same as fish on Earth, which was somehow both disappointing and reassuring. The tundra biome was quiet and cold and beautiful, and it attracted the kind of people who needed space and silence, and a small community of writers and artists and monks settled along its edges and produced work that would later be considered some of humanity's finest. And through it all, Amara Ose walked. She walked the full length of Eden on the day the population reached 1 million, a journey of nearly 60 kilometers that took her 14 hours. And she walked it alone, because she needed to see every biome and every corridor and every face and every growing thing with her own eyes, because she needed to know that it was real. She started in the urban core, where the morning shift was changing and people were heading to work or school or nowhere in particular. And she walked through the grassland where the first harvest of wheat was being collected by farmers who kept stopping to touch the grain as if they could not believe it existed. And she walked through the rainforest where the humidity wrapped around her like a blanket and the sound of insects, real insects, bred and released according to ecological models, filled the air with a buzz that she had not heard since she was a child. She walked through the desert biome, which was stark and beautiful and empty in a way that felt deliberate rather than dead, and through the wetland where frogs, actual frogs, cloned from preserved DNA, were singing their first chorus on a world that had no evening, and through the tundra where the air bit her cheeks and her breath came out in clouds. And finally she reached the oceanic biome, and she stood on a beach made of sand that had been processed from asteroid rock and smoothed by artificial tides, and she looked out at a sea that existed inside a metal ring floating in the void between two planets, and the waves rolled in and touched her boots, and she sat down on the sand and cried. She cried for Lagos, and for her mother and father and brother who were buried under black water on a world that was 225 million kilometers away. She cried for the 3,041 workers who had died building Eden, whose names were now engraved on a memorial wall in the urban core that stretched for 200 meters. She cried for Dr. Vasquez, who had survived her radiation burns but would never fully recover, and who now taught fusion physics to students from a wheelchair, and who smiled when she did it, which was somehow worse than if she had been bitter. She cried for Earth, which was still dying, slowly and terribly, and which would continue to die no matter what they did, because some things could not be saved, only mourned. And then she stopped crying, and she wiped her face with her sleeve, and she stood up, and she went back to work, because Amara Osai would always go back to work. It was the only prayer she knew. Far away in the great hall of the Conclave of 12, the reckoning had come. The Valith ambassador who had orchestrated Operation Still Garden had resigned in disgrace, and his replacement, a younger Valith who had privately opposed the sabotage, sat in the elder chair, and said nothing while the other species argued. The argument was simple: what to do about humanity. The old rules said that no species could be recognized as a sovereign galactic civilization without being uplifted by the conclave. It was the foundation of the entire system, the assumption that progress required guidance and that no species could skip the steps of development without supervision. Humanity had skipped every step, built a Class IV habitat with technology that the conclave considered primitive, survived an attempt to destroy them, and done it all while the galaxy watched. The Dremori ambassador stood and proposed a new doctrine. "We call it the Eden precedent," she said, and her voice carried the confidence of someone who knew that history was on her side. Any species that independently achieves a Class IV orbital habitat without external uplift is to be recognized as a sovereign galactic civilization with full rights, protections, and representation. Humanity is the first. They will not be the last. And the conclave must decide whether it wants to lead a galaxy of free species or rule a galaxy of dependent ones. The debate lasted 3 days, and when the vote was called, it passed 9-3, and humanity was formally recognized as a member of the galactic community. Dr. Elias Vren received the news on Eden, where he had been living for 6 months, and he was invited to the conclave's headquarters to formally accept the recognition on behalf of the human species. He traveled there on a Dremori vessel, and he stood in the great hall where his appeals had been rejected for 20 years, and he looked at the 12 delegations arrayed before him, some hostile, some neutral, some openly friendly, and he gave a speech that lasted less than 2 minutes. "We do not need your approval," he said, "but we will take your friendship. We have learned that building alone is possible, but building together is better. If you are willing to be our partners, we are willing to be yours. If you are not, that is fine too. We have gotten very good at doing things on our own." The hall was silent, and then the Dremori delegation began to applaud, a gesture they had learned from watching human broadcasts. And slowly, unevenly, other delegations joined, until the sound filled the ancient chamber like rain on a metal roof. On Eden, Yuki Tanaka retired. She had served the project for 12 years, and she was 63 years old, and her body ached from decades of low gravity and high stress, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that sleep could not fix. She chose a small cabin in the tundra biome, on a ridge overlooking a glacier that had been built from water she had hauled from the belt, and she spent her first day of retirement doing something she had been planning for a very long time. She planted trees. One for each name in her notebook, 219 trees, each one tagged with a small metal plate bearing a name and a date, and she planted them in rows along the ridge. And when the last one was in the ground, she closed the notebook for the final time and placed it in a sealed box at the base of the first tree. "Grow," she told them, and her voice was rough and quiet and full of everything she had never allowed herself to say. "Grow for them, they earned it." Then she went inside her cabin and sat by the window and watched the snow fall on the glacier. And for the first time in 12 years, Yuki Tanaka did absolutely nothing, and it was enough. On the day that Eden's population reached 100 million, the Communication Authority broadcast a message from the station's main array. A message aimed at every receiver in the galaxy, transmitted in every known language, and signed by no individual, but by a collective designation that had never been used before. The message said, "To all who told us we would fail, thank you. You made us prove you wrong. To all who helped us when we needed it, thank you. You reminded us we are not alone. To all who come after us, the void is dark and cold, build your fire anyway. The people of Eden, 2254 CA." The message traveled at the speed of light, spreading outward in an expanding sphere that would reach the nearest alien civilization in 4 years and the farthest in 10,000. And long after the people who sent it were dead and gone, it would still be traveling, still spreading, still carrying the simple, stubborn message that a species of short-lived, fragile, reckless, brilliant beings had shouted into the darkness. We were here and we built something, and it was good. In the grassland biome, under the fusion dawn, a woman held a newborn baby, the first child born on Orbital Eden after its official completion. And the baby cried the way all babies cry, loudly and without apology. And the sound echoed off the curved sky and mixed with the wind in the grass and the distant hum of the fusion core. Amara Osai heard the cry from across the biome, and she stopped walking, and she smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes and softened the hard edges that years of work and grief had carved into her face, and she whispered something that no one else heard. "Welcome home." Then she kept walking, because there was always more to build, and the stars were full of places that humanity had not yet reached, and Eden was not an ending. It was a beginning.